Stephen H. Phillips from the University of Texas at Austin, USA. Over to the chair.
Okay, I think many people are still, is this working? Yeah. Many people are still out. Maybe we could...
Wait for 2 minutes? Or?
Well, maybe
Just call
someone
them.
could round them up,
Yeah.
as we say in Texas. To 35 minutes, and then about 15 minutes of questions. And looking forward. Let's go.
So originally there was going to, wow. So originally there was going to be a handout, and we had some technical problems. So we thought we would try to put it up on the screen, but it's very clear you're not going to be able to see it. So the best thing is just to ignore the screen and ignore the handout, and we'll see if we can make our way without it. Right? This morning we heard two talks that took very different approaches to the way in which to engage classical Sanskrit philosophical texts with the philosophy of education. Stephen Phillips took a broadly analytical account to try to explain the way in which classical Indian philosophy operates with respect to the pramana system, and then attempted to make a conclusion, not attempted, made a conclusion about the relationship or lack thereof between that and the philosophy of education. Just a broadly analytical approach. Professor Sarukai instead took a constructive approach, where he asked, if we think about the concerns of classical Indian philosophy... Oh yeah, I don't need it though. It was for them. Yeah. If we actually immerse ourselves in classical Indian texts, what can we learn that's of relevance to contemporary issues in the philosophy of education? I'm going to take a third approach to this, not problem, this area of inquiry, by taking a historical approach. I'm going to try to describe in some detail one case study from the history of Buddhist philosophy in India, and then invite us all to consider on what significance, if any, there is for the kinds of concerns that we've been talking about today. Given the absence of a handout, some of this will be rough going. So I think the idea is to just bear with me and see what we can take away from it at the end. And we'll take then a pause and try to sort of take a break and see where we are. The claim that perception is free from conceptual construction, the famous phrase, pratyaksham kalpana bodham, is arguably the most basic tenet and characteristic feature of the Buddhist epistemological tradition. According to the Buddhist philosopher Jnanashri Mitra, however, it is also nothing but a white lie. More literally, as he says in his monograph on exclusion, this claim is just a conditionally adopted position. That is, like a white lie, it is a convenient fiction, which is strictly speaking false. But in being based on a little bit of the truth, and the phrase he uses, tattva lesham ashritya, it is still useful in specific philosophical contexts. The purpose of this paper is to discuss Jnanashri Mitra's radical claim and briefly consider its significance for understanding why Jnanashri Mitra thought that there was a history of Buddhist philosophy in India. Furthermore, attention to this issue points to the pedagogical vision implicit in the practice of Buddhist philosophy, or so I will argue. I'll structure my discussion around the following sets of questions. In part one, I'll focus on why Jnanashri Mitra thinks that the traditional claim about perception must be a conditionally adopted position, and explain what he means by this. In part two, I will discuss why Jnanashri Mitra thinks that Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who are the founding fathers of Jnanashri Mitra's Buddhist epistemological text tradition, told a white lie or two, and more specifically, why he thinks they said perception is free from conceptual construction. I will conclude by briefly touching on the broader pedagogical significance of Jnanashri Mitra's discussion of Dharmakirti's white lie. Is that okay? The basic idea is that Dharmakirti is the founding father of Jnanashri Mitra's entire way of doing philosophy, Dignaga and Dharmakirti. Dharmakirti made a claim that perception is free from conceptual construction. Jnanashri Mitra, in reflecting back on the history of this tradition, says, oh, Dharmakirti did in fact say that, but he didn't mean what he said. In fact, that statement is really just a white lie. We're trying to understand what he means by saying this, and what we can learn from this fact. In order to answer the question of why Jnanashri Mitra insists that the statement, perception is free from conceptual construction, is a conditionally adopted position, it is necessary to first take a step back and review what Jnanashri Mitra has to say about the sources of knowledge and their objects. Following Dharmottara, Jnanashri Mitra says that each source of knowledge must have two objects, one that is grasped and one that is determined. What these two objects mean is that if you're trying to ask What is it that one understands when one is a recipient of a source of knowledge, like we were talking about this morning, perception or inference? What do you need in order to explain it? Do you need one cognitive object to explain it, one thought broadly construed, or do you need two cognitive objects to explain it? Jnana Mitra thinks you need to have two cognitive objects to explain both the perceptual and inferential process. Here's what he says. He says, now for us, both modes of valid awareness, sources of knowledge, pramanas, have both objects because of a distinction between what is grasped and what is determined. For that which directly appears in an episode of awareness is what is grasped, but that with respect to which it, the episode of awareness, functions is what is determined. Now, for perception, what is grasped is a particular, and what is determined is a universal. But for inference, it is the reverse. He explains further that in both perception and inference, both appearance and determination are necessary. This is because for him, each mode of awareness must have a grasped object, that is, the object that directly appears in or is manifest to awareness, and a determined object, the object that we take ourselves to be acting with respect to. In the case of perception, the grasped object is generally called a particular, and the determined object a universal, while in inference, the grasped object is generally called a universal, and the determined object a particular. Thus, to properly account for both perception and inference, both appearance and determination are necessary. Nowhere in his work does Jnana Mitra back down from this position. Equally important to Jnana Mitra's basic picture is his insistence that the determined objects of both perception and inference are conceptualized. We'll take a moment and recover what this means in a second. In other words, for him, conceptualization is an equally important part of both perception and inference. When confronted with an objector who presses him to explain why Dharmakirti himself appears to use these terms contrastively, he says, conceptualization and determination refer to the same thing. It's just that the use of the word conceptualization is occasioned by connections with words and the like, while determination is occasioned by suitability for activity, even with respect to an object that is not grasped by awareness. Remember, I said earlier that according to Dharmakirti, the founding father of the text tradition, perception by definition is free from conceptual construction. That means there is just one cognitive object that you need to appeal to in order to explain perception itself, and that's this non-conceptualized object. Jnana Mitra clearly disagrees and says that you have to have two objects to explain the perceptual process. You need to have the object that non-conceptually appears to you or directly appears to you, and then you have the object that you take yourself to be seeing. So for example, the non-conceptual object would be seeing a bare particular, such as, and the conceptualized object would be your awareness that what you are directly seeing is a bottle. So seeing versus seeing as. Seeing is directly perceiving, is non-conceptually being aware of, and seeing as a bottle is conceptually being aware of. Dharmakirti says that only the non-conceptual seeing is properly called perception. Jnana Mitra says that no, it's both the seeing and seeing as that need to be taken as perception. The views clearly contradict. And so what Dharmakirti said, right, the claim that it's just seeing is a white lie in Jnana Mitra's view because it isn't correct. All right? For him, the two objects are necessary, the seeing and the seeing as. So according to Jnana Mitra, determination, so the issue is why. I should take a step back without the handout. So the first object, Dharmakirti says conceptualization isn't part of the perceptual process, right? Jnana Mitra says, well, he's then asked, why does Dharmakirti say this? And that's the quotation I just gave you. He says that, well, what Dharmakirti means by conceptualization is just, he uses the word conceptualization when he wants to emphasize some process that's connected with language. And he uses the word determination when he wants to refer to that same process in a non-linguistic form. That's what these terms conceptualization and determination refer to. I hope as we keep going, these issues will get a little bit clearer. According to Jnana Mitra, determination is really nothing but conceptualization, and conceptualization is really nothing but determination. The only meaningful difference between them is that the word conceptualization is generally used when we want to say that our mental image of an object is inextricably bound up with the form of the word that is used to refer to it. That is, in inferential verbal contexts. The word determination, on the other hand, is generally used when we want to talk about our mental images, as if they were objects that we could act upon, that is, in context of intentional activity. For Jnana Mitra, however, the terminological distinction between conceptual and determination is neither based on nor reveals a real difference in the mental processes to which these two terms refer. Rather, it is due to a fictional difference that is indexed in how the terms happen to be used. For Jnana Mitra, the objects of awareness fall into two neatly defined and mutually exclusive categories: those that are grasped and therefore free from conceptual construction, and those that are determined and therefore conceptualized. So in this language, the seeing that, right, is non-conceptualized. That's the grasped object. The object that I see that as, the bottle, is conceptualized or determined. And the issue is how this process works and how Jnana Mitra and Dharmakirti differ from one another. Thus, according to him, right, as I mentioned, perception cannot be free from conceptual construction. Is this clear? Because remember, for Jnana Mitra, seeing plus seeing as, that is, non-conceptual seeing plus conceptualized seeing as, are both necessary to account for perception. So both objects are necessary. The, quote, object seen and the object that you see something as. For Dharmakirti, it's very clear. It's only the object that you see that's part of perception. So the views clearly differ. That's the first point. And remember, differing from your teacher is not a good thing, because that means your teacher wasn't correct. So how one discusses innovation and yet respect for one's teacher is a fundamental challenge for creative thinking in the Indian philosophical tradition. And Jnana Mitra has a very, very clever way of dealing with this problem. That's by calling what his teacher said a white lie, right? A partial truth. All right. Since for Jnana Mitra, conceptualization has to be a part of the perceptual process, the problem of how to make sense of the traditional claim that perception is free from conceptual construction is not really a philosophical problem, since it cannot be correct, but rather an exegetical and historical one. It is in response to this primarily exegetical and historical imperative that Jnana Mitra appeals to his theory of conditionally adopted positions. Look, in a way, by definition, you cannot say that Dharmakirti, the founder of your text tradition, was wrong. Yet, it's very clear, as I hope to have suggested, that Jnana Mitra has a view that is incompatible with Dharmakirti's. So the problem comes, what do you do? Dharmakirti cannot be wrong, and yet he's not correct. So Jnana Mitra adopts this idea that what Dharmakirti must have done is told a white lie. That is, made a philosophical statement that is partially true, and he made it based on a partial truth in response to a very particular pedagogical objective. That's the idea. So here's Jnana Mitra's theory of conditionally adopted positions. In the following passage, Jnana Mitra develops his theory of conditionally adopted positions. He says, by relying on a little bit of the truth, a certain conditionally adopted position is constructed for a specific pedagogical purpose, in one way, even though the actual state of affairs is quite different, just as in the examples such as self. By relying on a little bit of the truth, namely the conceptual construction of a single continuum, we conventionally say, who else will experience the results of an action done by this very person, in order to frustrate the deceptive view that there is the passing away of what has been done and the onset of what has not been done. A conditionally adopted position is a kind of philosophically sanctioned white lie, a statement which is only partially true and is used for only specific and philosophically legitimate purposes. Jnana Mitra explains how conditionally adopted positions work by providing an example. In explaining the theory of karma, one may legitimately say that in the future, a person will experience the karmic results of actions that she now performs. Yet, this is not really true, since there is no person that endures through time. The statement is, however, based on a little bit of the truth, namely, that people generally do construct a mental continuum that they take to be an enduring self or person. Jnana Mitra explains that it is even legitimate for this partially true statement to be used in contexts where one needs to expose as false the view that our current actions do not have karmic consequences, or the view that we may experience karmic consequences that are not the result of our own previous actions. Elsewhere, Jnana Mitra points out that ordinary people could never function without such convenient fictions, and that asking them to do so would just leave them mentally exhausted. Maybe some of us are feeling that right now, too. Jnana Mitra makes it absolutely clear that his theory of conditionally adopted positions and his earlier discussion of conceptualization and determination are directly relevant for understanding what Dignaga and Dharmakirti have to say about perception. He says, "It is for this very reason that with a view toward the practically oriented person, whose mind has already been worn out with the mistaken idea that conceptualizing a thing and apprehending its nature are the same, that the qualifier free from conceptual construction is included in the definition of perception by Dignaga and Dharmakirti, and that in the authoritative text of Dharmakirti's Hetu Bindu, there is separate mention of conceptualization determination with the words on the basis of conceptualization by determination." Look, according to Jnana Mitra, both the claim that perception is free from conceptual construction and Dharmakirti's statement in the Hetu Bindu, where the terms conceptualization and determination are used contrastively, are just conditionally adopted positions. That is, they are white lies. They must be, Jnana Mitra thinks, because it is just not the case that perception is in fact free from conceptual construction, since, as he has pointed out, perception and inference each have a non-conceptual and a conceptual, that is, a determined object. Similarly, it is not the case that conceptualization and determination are different. At best, the two terms just pick out two different ways of referring to the same mental process. According to Jnana, therefore, what Dignaga and Dharmakirti have to say about perception cannot be literally true. Neither can really mean what they say. In order to account for their words, therefore, one has to realize that they are just stating conditionally adopted positions, that is, philosophically sanctioned white lies. In the passage just cited, Jnana only gestures to why such white lies are told. They are told, he says, for the sake of a person who just can't get his mind around the idea that conceptualization can be decoupled from language. Trying to persuade someone of this, at least at this point in their philosophical education, is just too much trouble, and in general would be counterproductive. In the final few pages of his monograph on exclusion, Jnana Mitra explains this in greater detail, and it is to this discussion that I now turn. Maybe we'll just take a second here. Look, why did Dharmakirti tell a white lie? Why did Dharmakirti say that perception is just seeing and doesn't include seeing as? Remember, to get from seeing to seeing as, everyone agrees you need some form of conceptualization, right? And Dharmakirti says that that conceptualization involves language. Now he wants to explain to people, look, what you think perception really is, that seeing as, isn't really what perception is. Perception is really non-linguistic. It's non-conceptual. But to teach people of that, he has to basically first start by telling that, look, perception is free from conceptualization, and you know what? Conceptualization doesn't involve language. That's the white lie. He needs to do that to help people understand this first part of the perceptual process, because he thinks it's too hard to do it all at once. There's a division of labor, in the sense in his pedagogical approach, and that division of labor requires telling a white lie for a very specific purpose, Jnana Mitra claims. By the way, there's no hint of this in Dharmakirti himself. This is Jnana Mitra's take. All right. So why does Jnana Mitra think that Dignaga and Dharmakirti told these white lies? Why do they speak as if conceptualization and determination are different? And why do they say that perception is free from conceptual construction when he has tried to show it just cannot be? Jnana Mitra's answer to these questions are based on his view that what generates the need to even say that perception is free from conceptual construction is the thought that since conceptualization is inextricably linked with language, right, we pre-philosophically tend to think that conceptualization involves language. After all, conceptualization seems to involve concepts, and many people think that concepts must be language involving, right? So then what generates the need to even say that perception is free from conceptual construction is our mistaken idea that since conceptualization is inextricably linked with language, it must be genuinely different from determination, and presumably the mental processes that Dharmakirti directly associates with perception itself. As just discussed, however, according to Jnana Mitra, the tradition's accommodation of the widespread but mistaken idea that conceptualization is generally different from determination is just a conditionally adopted position. Remember, what Jnana wants to say is that perception involves two parts, right? The seeing and the seeing as part. And to get from the seeing as part, you need determination. He also thinks determination is just the same as conceptualization. That means he thinks that conceptualization is both linguistic and non-linguistic. that you can conceptualize without language, and that when you conceptualize without language, we call that process determination. So what he's trying to do is say, look, in telling you only about the first object of perception, that is, the object that you see when you just see that, that doesn't involve language. Right? So he's still allowing for the possibility that Dharmakirti could accept determination. Does that make sense? So perception is free from conceptualization. Okay, it adds determination, Jnana Mitra says. And the way he says it adds determination is because Dharmakirti just chose not to tell you that part. He just chose to stop at the first lesson. Right? All right. So for Jnana Mitra, the terminological distinction between conceptualization and determination reveals only that people generally associate the object they conceptually apprehend with the word that they use to refer to it. It is because of this that they mistakenly believe that conceptually apprehending an object, bottle, and associating with its name are one and the same thing. When taken together with what Jnana Mitra said in the passage I read earlier, it is clear that according to him, it is in order to accommodate this little bit of the truth that Dharmakirti, Dignaga, and others in the Buddhist epistemological tradition speak as if conceptualizing an object and apprehending it in association with the word that is used to refer to it, and determining it, that is, apprehending it as an object that one can act upon, are different, even though they're one and the same. The little bit of the truth on which this conditionally adopted position is based is a truth about how these terms are generally understood. As Jnana Mitra implies, the purpose that is served in adopting this position is that by strategically conforming to the way in which these terms are generally used, it'll eventually be possible to correct people's false ideas about perception and the perceptual process. Having explained why conceptualization and determination are often used contrastively by his predecessors, Jnana Mitra is now in a position to explain why the statement, perception is free from conceptual construction, is also a conditionally adopted position. Underlying the strictly speaking false statement that perception is free from conceptual construction is also a little bit of the truth, namely that perception does in fact have a non-conceptual object that is grasped in the first part of the perceptual process. Jnana seems to believe that the reason why Dignaga and Dharmakirti only state this partial truth is that for people who take conceptualization to be necessarily language involving, it'll be too difficult to accept that conceptualization is a necessary part of perception too. Dignaga and Dharmakirti therefore work around this limitation by formulating a definition of perception that takes the first step toward clearly identifying the two objects of perception. According to Jnana, this is the purpose that is served in saying that perception is in fact free from conceptual construction. Although it is just a conditionally adopted position, Dignaga and Dharmakirti's one-object model of perception and inference is still an important step for an ordinary person, who Jnana suggests is already worn out by having to understand even this much. Just one technical question. Since we started at 11:30, I'll go until 10 after? 10 after? Is that fair?
How about 5?
All right. You will now be spared any explanation. Or maybe I'll just add, I don't know what I'm going to do. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. Sure, but I got gypped, Stephen. I got gypped by 10 minutes. Yeah. An objector soon... Are we following, basically, the problem or not? Is it okay? All right. So an objector soon argues that if all of this is supposed to be for the benefit of an ordinary person, then Jnana Mitra's insistence that the one object model of awareness, right, that there's only seeing, is supposed to lead us to the two object model of awareness is just wishful thinking. According to the opponent, ordinary people will never be able to grasp the distinction between what is seen, namely the grasped object of perception, and what is conceptualized, namely the determined object of perception. As a result, they will neither be able to understand that the phrase perception is free from conceptual construction is merely a conditionally adopted position, nor that the two-object model is philosophically superior. While acknowledging that that ordinary people do not generally distinguish between grasped and determined objects of perception, Jnana nevertheless argues that it is not difficult to show such a person that there is a clear difference between the grasped image of a perceived object, such as a campfire that is a few feet in front of one, and the conceptual image that appears when one recalls or imagines fire. Furthermore, one can show that many of the properties that we think belong to the fire that we see, for example, its capacity to heat things up, are not directly presented in the grasped visual image, but rather are derived from our memory of previous experiences with fire. Therefore, it can be clearly demonstrated that the fire that we take ourselves to be visually aware of, the fire that is available to us, is actually made up of what is visually present to us, the grasped object that appears directly in awareness, and what we conceptually construct on the basis of our previous experiences, that is, the determined object, for example, something hot. Thus, in perception, one can point to a clear phenomenal distinction between the grasped and determined objects. Moreover, because of this clear phenomenal distinction, it is also relatively easy to speak as if one of these objects is the real thing we perceive, Therefore, even an ordinary person can be shown that perception has both a non-conceptual and conceptual object, and that the phrase perception is free from conceptual construction is nothing but a white lie. So, despite the opponent's worries, it is possible to show an ordinary person that the one-object model of perception is a convenient fiction when compared to the philosophically superior two-object model. Thus, a specific and philosophically legitimate purpose is served by conditionally adopting the partial truth that perception is free from conceptual construction. While the one-object model is an important step toward the two-object model of perception, Jnanashri confesses near the end of his text that the two-object model itself is a white lie. More specifically, he says that although the two-object model is an improvement over Dharmakirti and Dignaga's lower-order convention, it is still conventional. Jnanashri explains that when speaking to an ordinary person who believes that the momentary object that appears to him and the temporally extended object that he takes the object of his subsequent activity to be are one and the same, it's important to say that perception really has two objects. A non-conceptual one, that's the grass moment, these Buddhists are momentarists, and a conceptually constructed one, the determined continuum, that is a point, a bottle, right? One of those, and the extended bottle. But at the end of the day, Jnanashri Mitra explains that perception, like inference and language, cannot have a real object at all. This is because in order for something to be a genuine object of awareness, it must both be available, that is directly present in awareness, and actionable, that is determined by awareness to be an object of activity. This is philosophically the only way to capture our intuitions about what an object of awareness must be. But as Jnanashri argues, nothing can be both grasped and determined. Thus, while his two-object model of perception is, for philosophical reasons, an improvement over the lower-order convention of the one-object model, it is still conventional and is adopted only conditionally. In the concluding part of this paper, I want to touch on the broader significance of Jnanashri Mitra's discussion of Dharmakirti's white lie, by briefly pointing to its significance for our understanding of the relationship between Buddhist philosophy and pedagogy and selected aspects on the Buddhist discourse on levels of truth. I'll conclude with a general historiographical principle that I think is implied by it. Jnanashri Mitra's discussion of Dharmakirti's white lie provides a model for understanding his perspective on the pedagogical significance of Buddhist philosophy. According to Jnanashri, his predecessors in the Buddhist epistemological tradition used convenient fictions and partial truths to philosophically educate those who they felt were in error. This is clear from Jnanashri's example of how the idea of an enduring self can be used to argue against those who do not accept karma. By standing on a higher rung of the philosophical stepladder than their targeted audience, Jnanashri's predecessors were able to reach down and help people up to the next philosophical rung, even if, according to Jnanashri Mitra, they themselves realized that this next rung was not the final one. It is because of their privileged position on the ladder that Jnanashri seems to think that Dignaga and Dharmakirti were able to clearly see and therefore effect what was going on below. The situation is no different for Jnanashri Mitra himself. It is from a philosophical vantage point, one step up the ladder, that is able to identify and expose Dharmakirti's white lies and other conditionally adopted positions to those who are not already aware of them. According to Jnanashri, the way that one learns to move up from rung to rung is by discovering conceptual problems inherent in how we speak about awareness and its objects. By discovering specific conceptual problems with the one-object model of perception, for example, Jnanashri expects us to move up to his two-object model. Similarly, by coming to see conceptual problems inherent in how we speak about awareness and its objects from within the two-object model, he expects us to move up to his no-object model. In both cases, conceptual problems become apparent by discovering how each model is based on a partial truth about the nature of objects and its awareness. It is important to note that the philosophical issues at stake have to do with the nature of awareness and the kinds of mental objects and processes that best account for it. Given the subordination of ontology to the philosophy of mind in Jnana-Shri-Mitra's text tradition, this is also just what one would expect. Philosophy then is of pedagogical significance, since it is through philosophical analysis and argumentation that a teacher like Jnana-Shri-Mitra is able to help his students move up from rung to rung of a philosophical stepladder. For Jnana-Shri-Mitra, philosophy is supposed to change people's minds by turning them away from their false or partially true views and towards that they think are more correct. The internal logic of Jnana-Shri-Mitra's account of conditionally adopted positions suggests that there are three levels of analysis, or rungs on the philosophical stepladder, in addition to a basement of false views. The first level is the one on which Jnana-Shri discovers that there to be a conditionally adopted position. This first level is characterized by Dignaga and Dharmakirti's statements about valid awareness and their objects. More specifically, on level 1, perception is said to be free from conceptual construction and to have only a real particular as its object. Similarly, according to Jnana-Shri, it is only a conditionally adopted position to say that inferential verbal states of awareness are inherently conceptual and only have exclusion as their objects. Like perception, inference too is supposed to have two objects. In this numbering scheme, the views of Dignaga and Dharmakirti themselves argue against, for example, non-Buddhist views would be in the basement, right? So there's a basement, a pseudo-level 0. This is also the level on which Jnana-Shri-Mitra himself seems to place such views. So non-Buddhist views, or views that are just false and not white lies, are 0. Unlike the philosophical claims made on level 1, which is where the white lies are told, level 2 is a position on which a position is conditionally adopted by Jnana-Shri-Mitra himself. This is the level of Jnana-Shri-Mitra's own conditionally adopted two-object model of awareness. On this level, it is clear that perception is not free from conceptual construction, since it can be shown that it has two objects, a grasped and a determined one. Similarly, it is clear, two objects. It is moreover only from the vantage point of level 2 that the position adopted on level 1 can be seen just to be a conditionally adopted one. That is to notice that the lower levels on the rung are still levels on a rung moving up, but that they're not the final one. You have to actually be on the higher level. You have to be on level 2 to notice that level 1 is a level 1. Just like you have to be on level 1 to notice that level 0 is just false. Level 2 is also the level that Jnana-Shri relies on in criticizing his opponent's views, such as the existence of Ishvara, for example, and on the basis of which he establishes his own philosophical positions, such as momentariness and the efficacy of the Buddhist path. That is, for Jnana-Shri, level 2 is the level on which philosophy is practiced. The top level, however, is level 3, the level from which Jnana-Shri-Mitra's own conditionally adopted positions on level 2 can be identified as such, and on which no position is itself conditionally adopted. This is the level of Jnana-Shri-Mitra's view that neither perception nor inference has an object at all. Jnana-Shri-Mitra's theory of... is that okay? Look, so level 0 is false views. Level 1 are partially true views, the level of Jnana-Shri-Mitra's teachers. Level 2 is the level on which Jnana-Shri-Mitra does philosophy. That's the level on which he discovers that the views of his teacher on level 1 are just white lies, because they're partial truths necessary to get someone from level 0 up to level 1. Jnana-Shri is able to get you from level 1 up to level 2, and level 2 is where philosophy is. That's still a white lie, because the truth is that perception and inference, the sources of knowledge, have no real object. But if you adopt that view, you have no philosophical position to give at all, because all philosophical theories are conditionally adopted positions indexed to some pedagogical objective. It's instrumental reasoning in this view. Jnana-Shri-Mitra's theory of conditionally adopted positions further suggests that for him, the second of the three levels of analysis is the highest level of so-called conventional truth, and the levels below it are just lower order conventions. This is confirmed by Jnana-Shri himself, who clearly believes that the second level of analysis provides the philosophically most rigorous way for us to speak about perception and inference and their objects. According to him, his two-object model thus provides the best philosophical theory of perception and inference. Although it is the most philosophically rigorous way for us to account for perception and inference, it is still a white lie, since such awareness events do not really have a coherent object at all. Thus, the best philosophical account that can be given of the content of such modes of awareness is ultimately still not the case. Relative to level 1, it is still just a higher order convention. As the discussion makes clear, an analysis of the two-object model of awareness reveals that it too is a white lie, and that it is in fact a no-object model of awareness that provides the most rigorous philosophical account of awareness, though not of perception and inference, and is therefore what is ultimately the case. Jnanashri-Mitra's theory of conditionally adopted positions also suggests what to some may be a shocking historiographical principle. The principle that it is sometimes the future that can best tell us what the past was about. According to Jnanashri, his predecessors in the Buddhist epistemological tradition used convenient fictions and partial truths to philosophically educate those who they felt were in error. It is because of their privileged position, one level up the philosophical ladder, that Jnanashri seems to think that Dignaga and Dharmakirti were able to clearly see what was going on below. The situation is no different from Jnanashri himself. It is from his privileged philosophical vantage point that he is able to detect and expose Dharmakirti's white lies and those of his predecessors in the Buddhist epistemological tradition. For Jnanashri, there is a history of Buddhist philosophy in India because Buddhist philosophers like Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and Jnanashri-Mitra needed to gradually improve upon the white lies of their predecessors as a way of helping others progress on the path. If people were right from the very beginning, there would be no need for a history of Buddhist philosophy in India. There would be the first statement of Buddhist philosophy and we would be done. So the history has to be accounted for somehow. And the history is accounted for through this gradual improvement on the white lies told by one's teachers. Jnanashri-Mitra's theory further suggests that if we are to fully understand this history of Buddhist philosophy in India and genuinely learn from it, it'll be necessary for us to look back on the texts of philosophers like Dignaga and Dharmakirti from the vantage point of their successors. Jnanashri-Mitra's own analysis of this history suggests that one way that we can do this successfully is to ask ourselves the same three questions that he asks of his own predecessors. As the theory of conditionally adopted positions requires, we should not only ask ourselves what the philosophers we are studying actually said, but we must also ask ourselves what they knew but did not say, and what we know that they did not. Jnanashri-Mitra's work is just a powerful reminder that to understand and learn from the text traditions of Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and others in the Buddhist epistemological tradition, we must, like Jnanashri-Mitra himself, not only learn how to be philologists, that is, pay attention to very close and careful reading of these texts in their original languages, but also historians of philosophy and also philosophers in our own right. It is in reflecting on and pursuing these questions that a philosopher like Jnanashri-Mitra rigorously articulates and analyzes for the very first time the pedagogical principle so often associated with the Buddha, that is, the principle of skillful means. Thank you.
Very difficult conceptions. I can't resist making the remark that, the Buddhists see lying as a pedagogical method. We have.
As you know, this is an implicit criticism of the whole idea of discourses on level of truth that non-Buddhist philosophers always make, and not without good reason. I think that by Jnanashri's time, you get a principled defense of this strategy, which actually I think makes interesting philosophical sense.
Okay, questions. Do you want?
I don't think I can take 7 at once.
You want to do them individually then, or 2 or 3?
Well, let's try 2 or 3.
Okay. And here we have 1, 2, 3.
3. Let's do 3 at a time.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Presentation. What came to mind was this has been a consistent theme in Buddhist teaching. If we see suttas versus Abhidhamma, you see a different level of this conditional, teaching that you talked about. But the question that comes to mind is, how can you be sure that your level 3 is the last step? And how can you be sure that it is not an infinite regress in some way? Somebody comes and, finesses it further and realizes that, oh, you were not on the ultimate level, but you were in a penultimate level of the final one.
We're going to have to do one at a time.
Okay, one at a time.
I'm not going to be able to make it otherwise. Is this thing, where's the button?
I think it's supposed to be on.
Is this on? The way they're sure is the same way they're sure about everything. That is, they philosophically defend it. So level 3 about pramana has the claim that swasamvednam eva pramanam. That means that reflexive awareness is in fact the only genuine source of knowledge. So if reflexive awareness is the only genuine source of knowledge, there's really nowhere else for you to go in terms of knowledge claims. So the way they're certain is the same way they're certain about everything else. They philosophically defend it. And here's how the basic argument goes. They say that the purpose of philosophy is twofold. It's first to show your opponents that they're mistaken and defend your own views. So what do you do when that happens? You argue not just against your opponent's conclusions, for example, the existence of Ishvara, against the Nayayikas, for example, but you also argue against the epistemology that supports those conclusions. So where are we? If we're the opponents, we now have no more conclusions, and we also have no way of getting any conclusions. So first is to argue against the others. Then they say, look, we've already softened up our opponents. Now I've got something to sell you. I've got a new set of conclusions and a new epistemology that comes with it. So now where's the student? The student has adopted this Buddhist epistemology and the conclusions that come with it. What is the most important conclusion, they say? They say, look, if you read the Buddha's teachings carefully, whether it's suttas or abhidharma, actually they didn't read suttas, they read sutras, and there wasn't abhidhamma, there was Vasubandhu's abhidharma, right? This was all Sanskrit based. They'll say the most important conclusion, the essence of the Buddha's teaching is momentariness. So we can prove momentariness through an inference, and we can prove that by meditating on momentariness, you will actually get on the first stage, the fifth stage of the Bodhisattva path. So the point is that in terms of how you know there isn't a regress is because it establishes that the object of meditational practice is a cognitive one called momentariness. You have to establish it philosophically because meditating is kind of boring, and if you're not totally convinced by yourself that momentariness is true, you might give up. So once you meditate on it, then you'll come to see that all things are momentary, and that then gets you on the soteriological path. So it's through philosophy itself that they try to defend the claim that that's the end.
Okay.
Ask about the idea of meditation and the conceptualization of momentariness. But the other thing was also that I think he also derives from the way Buddha himself taught.
Who's he?
Jnanashamitra. And the whole history of philosophers teaching one after another in the Buddhist tradition draw from the whole philosophy of teaching of Buddha itself, the Anupabhimarga, where you teach to the level of the student. You first assume there's a self, and then you teach him, and then once he meditates and he's on the momentariness, then you bring in new knowledge to kind of teaching at levels, as you said. And it was brilliant the way you brought it out in a particular case study of conception. So,
one thing that's so fascinating about this, we all know these slogans about the Buddha, skillful means, that he teaches in this way. What's astonishing is that until Jnanashamitra, I've seen no systematic philosophical defense by any Buddhist philosopher of this method. And therefore, we have a very, very poor understanding of exactly what that method is. So what happens is that when we talk about Buddhism in India, we tend to brandish this slogan in almost any way we like, for almost any end that we like. And I think that that's probably not a good habit. And so I'm happy that you see the connection, because I think it's really there.
Because I was wondering where does it come in, except for that one or two anecdotal stories from how Buddha teaches, but it was very good to find this evidence. The second thing was a little more on this meditative practice, because concepts as being experiential, and you can only, somewhere in the study of Buddhism, I can't remember exactly where, it says that unless you meditate, the concepts are not complete. You don't get knowledge without meditation. And I'm making a cliched statement, I know, but you get what I mean. The experience is what gives the concept its fullness.
These Buddhist philosophers would say that's completely false. That knowledge produced by a knowledge source is necessarily conceptual. And that if without that conceptual knowledge, you have no hope of breaking free from to non-conceptual awareness. So look, this is a way of Buddhist philosophers like Jnanashri, Dignaga, and everyone also justifying to their fellow Buddhists why they're Buddhists. This tradition was criticized for a long time for not being properly Buddhist, precisely because of concerns like this. And so they have to have an account of cultivation, bhavana, that actually is consistent with their own philosophical method and also responds to the demands that their community places on them.
This gentleman, we have, or over here. Who do we have?
I think you made me appreciate Zen Buddhism a bit more, your talk. Would you agree that what Zen is trying to do is skip over this whole philosophical discussion by saying there's no path from the basement to awareness that leads through language and through concepts. There's only a path from the basement to sudden enlightenment as a result of meditation. The whole idea of the koan, for example, seems to me to be, there is no conceptual answer to, you know, the sound of one hand clapping or the Buddha, whether a dog has Buddha nature. Okay. There's only awareness. So would you agree that, I mean, from the Zen point of view, the whole tradition you describe seems very scholastic, and Zen seems to be on the right path by saying we need to skip it, the entire step.
Just very briefly, I think, firstly, we should be careful. There's no such thing as Chan or Zen per se. There is a tradition, and within that tradition there are also scholastics. And those scholastics do argue that this kind of incremental analytical way of proceeding is actually not either effective or not correct, but they argue in an analytical way themselves. Right? So there are Zen Chan scholastics, but the general point that, look, this entire way of having to first disprove others and prove your own views and prove momentariness and meditate, it's gonna, you know, it seems rather inefficient, and there must be another way. This debate about how one achieves soteriological success was also debated hotly in India and also in Tibet, and it has to do with this, it's often phrased as the difference between sudden and gradual enlightenment. And so you're right that this discussion was contested, and there are people even in the Indian Buddhist context themselves who argued the opposite view. This is just one tradition. It's very important that we not think of Buddhist philosophy picks out nothing meaningful unless you specify which text tradition, and even within the text tradition, which particular philosopher. Only then can we begin to ask about continuities. But the point is absolutely well taken. There is a contrasting view. It was hotly argued, and it's certainly one accepted by some Chan philosophers in both China and Japan.
Shall I go for it?
Very good.
I think it's linked a little bit to that question. The level 2 looks very much like Robert Brandon's theory of conceptual articulation, inferences and so on, inferential articulation actually. And this theory has, of course, huge pedagogical implications. For it requires us, for example, to teach the children not facts, not bodies of knowledge, but the inferences between the different contents, between different conceptual contents. Now I'm wondering what are the pedagogical implications of the level 3, or how these pedagogical implications or educational implications could look like, since you stated something like there are no objects anymore, so that would mean for me that there are no contents anymore. Therefore, actually, there are no perceptions anymore and no inferences anymore. And what does it mean for pedagogy then?
Two things. First, the last part first. I think at best it means that it results in humility. If you're on level 2 and you know that level 2 is still a white lie, and level 3 is actually where you have to stop, then you have a kind of humility about level 2. But living in level 3 will be completely useless from a pedagogical purpose, because even if you were to articulate anything you understood in so-called level 3, you have to do it in level 2, language. So level 3, I'd say, is pedagogically idle, though the fact of it may result in humility, which I take it as a good virtue. The issue of Brandom and inferentialism is really an interesting one here, because, as you know, Buddhists don't accept testimony as an independent source of knowledge. They think that all knowledge that comes from testimony is actually subsumed under inference. And they have a process whereby they explain that. What's different about their process is that the inferential rules that, in a way, Brandom relies on are explained by just conventionality. And so we'd have to look quite carefully at what exactly is entailed by that distinction. It's a fundamental one. So in a way, conventions are taught, but they're really not taught in quite that way. We have them, and we're taught as we grow up, in a sense. So that's where we'd have to look at that. But that's a conversation maybe for later. But I think the connection is a good one.
We have time for one or two more. Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, my question basically is about like how do you see the agency of the learner in this? Is because it seems that, you know, like that for the learner in this first case, it's like reflexivity is not a starting point, because like it seems that the learner will not accept it until and unless we tell them a white lie. And then it's leading towards a certain stage which might be the level 3, like at the end point, and then you become reflexive as you go on. Maybe when you are at level 1, then you become a bit more reflective, and then you look back that then you understand that level 1 was like a white lie if you are at level 2, and then maybe when you reach level 3, then you even understand that level 2 was a white lie. So in that sense, it seems that agency of the learner is somewhat, I don't know, how do you conceptualize agencies in this context? And so it's kind of the teacher leading the student towards a certain kind of understanding rather than the student kind of exploring or discovering it for themselves. So it's basically not really, I don't know how does then this kind of discussion or pedagogy, I don't know how does it take place.
Theory of action.
No, I think this is a really good point. I mean, look, this whole model requires that the teacher know the right answer, that the teacher have an idea what the student knows, and the teacher has some idea how to get the student from what she knows to what she should know in the next lesson. That's absolutely true. This is not free wandering reflection at all. It's very structured instrumental learning. The question is whether, if we're going to evaluate it, how problematic that is. The student is certainly engaged intellectually, because you remember, you cannot simply accept what the teacher says. You have to actually understand it for yourself and be able to defend it. So there's a very, very clear sense of intellectual engagement in the entire process, I think. So I think that's not a problem. And also, if you think of how we all learn chemistry, for example, I don't know how you learn chemistry, but I was told a white lie, actually a fiction when I started, about the Bohr model of the atom. And later you get to quantum mechanics and things change. And so the question is whether we don't also have more of this in our system than we really acknowledge, and then we can ask whether it's effective or not, or in what context it isn't. But I think those are the fundamental parameters of this.
That's a very nice analogy. We have time for just one more question. There in the middle.
This might be somewhat unfair because it sort of moves across traditions, but still trying to grapple with this notion of the white lie. And I was wondering if you could compare it very broadly, perhaps, at this point, with the old Greek distinction between esoteric and exoteric, and if there was some common ground or if there were clear distinctions there. Yeah, that's the question.
I mean, that distinction itself in the Greek tradition is not univocal. So we have to be very clear on exactly what you mean by it. My gut feeling is that it might not be a constructive comparison, but whether it's constructive or not will all depend on what happens at the end of our conversation, I guess.
Okay, what an excellent discussion, and thank you very much. We will move now. We move now to our second speaker, Nan Kishore Acharya Maha Upadhyaya.